Welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hey, Heartful Parent Podcast listeners. Thank you so much for joining me for another week of the Heartful Parent Podcast. I appreciate you. And if this is your first time joining us on the podcast, I appreciate you as well. Thank you for being here. I hope that you will get a lot out of today's conversation. I'm really thrilled to introduce you to today's guest, a woman by the name of Emily Hughes. Emily hails from the other side of the pond, if you are US based. She lives in London, UK, and is a conscious parenting coach, somatic therapist, and a mom of two. She works with parents who are struggling with anger, frustration, and disconnection, and helps them rise into their inner trust so that they can handle any parenting situation with calm, sturdy confidence. I mean, who doesn't want that, right? She works one-on-one with co-parents and with groups to help parents get intentional and consciously aware in their parenting. And she uses a very parent-centric and body-based approach to identify the limiting beliefs, patterns, mindsets, and conditioning that keep parents stuck. Parents who come to see Emily leave inspired and empowered. She offers clients practical strategies based in nonviolent communication and nervous system awareness, and helps them do the deeper work to discover what fears, shame narratives, and patterns might be in the way and preventing them from using the strategies that they know. I think you will hear as we dive into this conversation today that Emily and her approach is so relatable. In fact, I share ways that she and I have very similar stories with an experience of rage and just really struggling early on in our parenting journeys to manage that rage and anger and to kind of step into the calmness and joy of parenting. In this, you're going to hear about the role that shame plays in all of this and how that might actually be lurking behind your anger and reactivity. You're going to hear about how yelling can actually be a protective pattern of behavior and how getting clear on your values might help explain some of the anger that you are experiencing. I think Emily also really drives home in everything she says the idea that the opposite of anger isn't necessarily being calm, but it's really empathy and understanding. There's a lot of great stuff in this conversation today. I hope you enjoy it. And without further ado, Emily Hughes. Hey there, Emily. Welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm so excited to have you.
Hey, thanks. I'm so glad to be here.
So obviously I just introduced, you to the listeners. So I want to jump right in.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually want to start with having you describe a little bit about how you became a parent coach and, kind of what has your journey been in terms of parenting and coaching?
Yeah. I think my journey really began from horizontal parenting. And what I mean by that is when I look back at it now, I see that I was in parental burnout. And how that was manifesting was just being really angry all the time and also just being so exhausted emotionally that I was basically just kind of lying down on the sofa, like barking orders at my children. And it sort of reached a point where I was like, I'm not functioning. I was also a high school teacher at the time, and just the emotional intensity of being with teenagers all day and then coming home to, in the school I was at, there was a lot of behavior issues. And coming from that and coming home to my own children, I was just completely emotionally exhausted.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. And I think like anger, it was like it was like a rage that I had never experienced before. And I think
Mhm.
it was, for me, it was a lot of it was about like the desire to control. And that really came from a really deep fear. I later learned, I didn't realize at the time, which was basically this thing of like, if I don't control everything, then we won't be safe.
Ah, uh-huh.
Yeah, and I think that was coming up for me sort of like in the classroom as well, like in my teaching career, where I'm like, I've got to control everything, or things are going to get out of control, and then, everything's going to go wrong, we'll be wildly unsafe. And that was translating at home as well. And I just did not have that inner sense of safety. And
Mhm.
there's this constant like need to control. And I also think my expectations of my eldest son, who was 3 at this time, were wildly unrealistic. Like wildly unrealistic. And I think all of these things were culminating into this anger. And I went
Mhm.
and saw a conscious parenting coach, and I found it to be a fantastic experience. And I was like, this is what I've got to do. I've got to get out of teaching. This is what I've got to train in. This is what I want to do with my life. And I think the other thing that really motivated me from having been a high school teacher was that the eye rolling at
Ah,
parents' evening.
uh-huh.
So it's a little bit like this. It was like I was fascinated by the dynamics in the parents' evening, right? Where it would be 20% of the children, there's like this mutual loving respect between them and their parents. And then there's sort of like 70% eye rolling. And then there's just sort of the other 10% is just sort of like just very passive. And I'm like, how do I get into the 20% of mutual respect and just this easy flow of connection? And that was really what was motivating me. So my burnout and my desire to have that. And that's really where my journey to becoming a conscious parent coach
Uh,
came
you know,
from.
it's so interesting to hear you tell that story because I relate to that in so
Mm,
many different ways. And I also had a period in parenting where I experienced rage that I had never experienced before. And mine was after the birth of my first
mm,
daughter. So there was some postpartum stuff going on,
yeah.
for that first year. But just like you, I think it came back to this safety. And I mean, my whole life had been upended, right, by parenting,
Mm,
and the rage and the anger was so foreign to me. And I remember thinking, like you, there has to be a better way to
mm,
do that. Like, and I remember thinking, man, parents need support that they are not getting, right? I'd never even
mm,
heard of a parent coach at that point.
mhm, yeah.
And it just doesn't feel good. The rage does not feel good for anybody.
Mm.
Yeah. So
I, I,
I
I
totally relate.
I remember in my first year, I had this really kind of like pivotal memory in my first year of being a parent, where I'm on the street and I am I'm completely losing control. I am like mad hot with rage. And what it was my tiny baby was not napping when they were meant to be napping. And it was a real kind of point for me in that first year where I was like, whoa, this is rage I've never felt before. My whole body is on fire from this loss of control. And with this tiny baby. And I think it's very real, the rage in that first year. And I think that if that rage is not tended to and soothed, then I think it can carry on and come up in like lots of different ways when we're triggered by our children throughout our parenting journey.
Oh my gosh, 100%. Yeah, and nothing makes a parent feel worse because I have a moment that I remember very clearly as well. it was at night when my tiny baby daughter was not sleeping and she was supposed to be sleeping. And I remember putting her down in the crib, not terribly gently. I mean, I wasn't hurting her, but it wasn't this soft lay down, and going into my husband, and you'll have to excuse my language, but I said to him, you better go get that fucking baby. I am done. Like, I'm done. And I was so mad, and nothing, like the shame that came up from that later at how angry I could be at this tiny little human who I desperately wanted. Like, a parent, being a parent was a very intentional decision for my husband and me. And to think, oh my God, in that moment, I would have sold her on the street in a heartbeat. And I know that rage that you had the day, on the street, and that I, like, we're surely not the only parents who have experienced that and then had the shame bubble up. So you touched on something, in describing your own journey that I noted that I relate to, which is that desire to control. And that comes from a need for safety. And when your whole world has been rocked by parenting, like, there are a lot of things that don't feel safe, even when we have teenagers. So talk to us a little bit about why that is, or what's going on when parents are getting angry. And I will separate out, like, obviously postpartum anxiety, depression, and sort of rage that comes out of that is a somewhat different scenario, right?
Yeah.
So, but we all still feel angry sometimes with our kids.
Yeah.
I have a 14-year-old, and I still sometimes am like, ah!
Yeah. And I think one of the things about anger, so I'm also trained in somatic therapy as well, and I weave the somatic work, so like the body-based work, basically, into my coaching, because anger is such a body up emotion. We're feeling it in our bodies so viscerally. And I think when you say that safety piece, it's like a lot of the behaviors of anger, like yelling, for example, I like to talk about them as protective behaviors, because what they're trying to protect is our sense that something has been violated. Now, often we're very unaware of what has been violated because we're often unaware of our values, and we're often unaware of our boundaries, and we're often unaware of our expectations. And all of these things are coming into the mix when we're triggered. And if we are a sensitive person, and I think sensitive people are often the ones who are very prone to getting angry. And sometimes they don't make that connection between being an angry person and being a highly sensitive person. So anyway, basically, there's this sense of violation, and then it doesn't feel safe because it's like, I can't, these things, like, I can't grab hold of them. They're kind of intangible. And so I've got to protect. And then this kind of like rage comes up, which is like, I'm protecting this value, but hold on, I'm not actually even aware of what the value was in the first place. It's just kind of milling around. I'll give you an example of this. So I was getting really annoyed on Sunday mornings. And the situation was, my husband's gone out to do exercise on Sunday morning. Like, I go out and do exercise on Saturday morning. He goes out and does exercise on Sunday morning. And every Sunday morning, I am feeling it gets, I'm kind of like all chilled out. The kids are in their pajamas. We're having breakfast. It's all nice. And then it gets to 10:15. And then I started to lose it. And what I was like, what? Why am I getting so angry at 10:15 every Sunday? And I figured out what it was that actually I've got this really strong value on outdoor time. And to me, being at home, 10:15 was the start of when I would start to get like a bit itchy about going outdoors. And then it really came up for me that through having been coached on this, that's what's coming up for me was that value is really strong, but there was also a real fear about being lazy, and this idea that if we just stayed around the house all morning without like going outdoors, that I would be lazy. And that's definitely, I can see that I can connect the dot back to my childhood. And I think so. I'm having this crazy expectation that we're going to like get out into nature and like, you know, and my kids, their expectation is that they're going to play, right? And they're going to have a slow pace time in their pajamas. And like, there's this real kind of conflict of needs and conflict of my value. And then there's like all of this is coming up, but quite unconsciously. And then when I became aware of all of this, I just chilled out because I can see it. And then, we get out of the house at, 11:30, even 12, like it doesn't matter. Like, but there's all of this background noise going
Yes.
on where, yeah, it can feel like if I'm not meeting my value, if I'm not, meeting this expectation, then I'm failing and I'm not safe.
Oh, well, and there's nothing like a sense that you're not meeting your own expectations, that all of those, the way you described the emotions that were coming up for you and not feeling safe in that moment. Of course, anger is bubbling up. And I love the way you describe that, because there is so much going on in the background for most of us all the time, right?
Yeah.
Or I shouldn't even say most of us, for all of us,
all of us, yeah.
right? All the time, that we aren't really aware of. So, I want to ask about how we get aware of that. But first, I'm curious, I think a lot of parents have a very difficult time. And this isn't really unique to parenting. This is a lot of humans have a very difficult time talking about their anger or even admitting to feeling angry. And I have to admit, the story that I told you about getting angry at my daughter's now 14. That was years ago. I have clearly, I've worked through that, past that, right? Moved on, and now help parents avoid that. And still telling that story, I'm like, oh, that's hard to talk about it.
Yeah.
Why is that so hard to talk about and admit to for all of us?
I think first off, you mentioned shame earlier, and I think we've been so heavily conditioned that anger is shameful, and that anger needs to be stopped quickly, and that anger is a sign that you're out of control. And I think also there's a big piece in here about females being angry, because there's so many things, as in like there's a whole list of words which I'm struggling to remember around like derogatory terms for, it's basically sort of like hysterical woman, right?
Yes.
It's like if a man is angry, he's powerful. If a woman is angry, she's hysterical and out of control.
Right.
And so I think that there's, and men of course, there's other issues being a man and having anger as well. But I think for women, it's often we've not been taught how to be empowered in our anger, how to healthily express anger. And so because we've not been taught that, because we've sort of maybe been like hushed down, I've worked with some women before who just cannot express anger at all. And I think there's a big link as well between your ability to express anger and anxiety, because it's got to come out in some way. And sometimes if particularly women are unable to express the anger, it can come out as anxiety instead. So I think there's so many cultural bits around this, and there's the shame. And I think it's, shame and failure. Getting angry can feel like you've failed. And I think that's where that kind of shame bit comes in. And I run workshops on like mother rage, and this is my kind of like niche that I like to work in. And I really like working with parents who struggle with their anger, because actually they can make really, really quick and quite rapid change once they are in an environment which is de-shaming. And I
Yes.
think that that's the key thing. As soon as they find solidarity with other parents, like who also feel anger, it's like that's where the door kind of opens to being able to look underneath the anger and get curious. But if we're stuck in shame, then I think the doors don't open and we never get to kind of like look clear-eyed at what is underneath our anger. And that's the place where we can get really stuck.
Yeah. I mean, that makes total sense, because when we are ashamed of something, whatever it is,
Yeah.
right, that shuts down us being open about it in most cases. And yet when we can realize that we're not the only ones, right? I mean, you know, you and I have never met before today, and we both just shared stories of feeling this intense anger towards a baby. I think you're absolutely right that when we can get and connect with other parents and understand this is part of the human experience, but also that we can change it, we're not powerless to change it. That feels empowering. So what can a parent do? You know, when you work with parents, what can a parent do when they find themselves in that stuck place? They don't want to be angry all the time. They don't, or even if it's not all the time, they don't want to be losing their temper with their children or their partners or whoever. And, you know, they're finding themselves to be far more reactive than feels good.
Yeah.
What can they do?
Okay, so something I haven't mentioned is, and I'm going to tell you a little story so this, a few days ago, I had what can only describe as an angry tantrum. And I'm going to tell you why that happened. Basically, I was able to see why it happened, and actually it's quite funny. But my son had been to a music class, and every child had been given a kazoo, and he was loving this kazoo. And he did this thing all evening where he was making this fake crying noise into his kazoo and finding it absolutely hilarious. And the noise was just intense. And where I'm going to with this is overstimulation. When parents are feeling sensorily overstimulated, they can snap like this. And all of that stuff underneath the behavior, so those thoughts, those beliefs, those values, those expectations, those boundaries, they can become really, really, really magnified extremely quickly. And one of my first ever clients, one of the things that we realized with her was that she was wildly overstimulated. And so what she was practicing was, when she was in that mode, or she was about to go into like explosion mode, what she would say to herself was, I am feeling really overstimulated right now. And just with that, gave a little bit of spaciousness, because the way that we parent is very unnatural. We are in these houses. We're meant to be parenting in like forests, right? We're in houses where the acoustics are terrible and sound is bouncing all over the wall, and we've got stuff everywhere, and people can become very quickly auditorily overstimulated and very quickly visually overstimulated. And then if you're a sensitive person with lots of these, you know, thoughts and beliefs and maybe values that you can't articulate yet going on, that's like the snapping point, where that can be a really snapping point for a lot of parents, is that overstimulation. So how do you address that? I would say one of the things I say to my clients, and this is a really fun one, start moving really, really slowly, because your body needs to feel safe. And what starts happening when we're starting to get heightened in our nervous system, going into like the fight pathway in our nervous system, everything starts to move quickly, and we move kind of jerkily, rapidly, and our eyes start darting all over the place. So the way that we can consciously counteract this from a body up way is to just start moving extremely slowly. And this has a double effect because children find it funny. And, and you've taken a moment where, you're about to have an explosion, and actually turned it into a point of connection with your body and your inner world, and a point of connection with your child who's looking at you and going, what's mummy doing? And so that's a little nugget that I think is really helpful.
I love that. Let me ask you this though, Emily, because in my work with my own clients, I have found there are a number of people who really struggle to, you talked about that sort of saying of, I'm feeling really overstimulated right now, or, starting to move slowly. And I think some people express they don't even have enough space to get there, because they don't recognize when they're going to go from in control to losing it. So I'm curious how you have helped people start to create the space in that moment, or start to get connected with what's going on with their bodies when they feel like they've got no connection there.
Yeah. So I think this is why in my coaching, I do a lot of pausing and doing that internal, what's happening in your body right now, because so many of us are so disconnected from concentrating on our internal world. And I think this is really at the root of it, why, because we can go for years and years and years living quite disembodied lives, not in the present in our bodies, and then our children come along and they are so embodied and they are so present in their own bodies because they don't know any other way to be. So a lot of the work I do is a lot of that like gentle embodiment work. What is it like to be with the body, to notice emotions in the body? And I think it's a nudging process. So I like this idea. I think it's I read it in Daniel Siegel's book, around like you've got 6 seconds. You might be familiar with that. 6 seconds between the stimulus and then like your body being flooded with sort of like cortisol and adrenaline, and then you're,
Yes.
And I think it's like some people are at 0.6 seconds before the system is flooded. And I think it's a process of tiny nudges, like little nudges every day to create that spaciousness. And that's what one of my clients finished a 12 weeks with me recently, and I asked him what was the biggest thing they got, and he said that I've got a bit of spaciousness between that stimulus from whatever's happening in my parenting, my child, that stimulus, and then that little bit of spaciousness to concentrate on what's happening in my body, what's happening and I think really it comes to slowing down.
Yeah.
Because when we have that internalized urgency and that internalized sense of lack of safety, and that everything's very high stakes, that's when everything feels like bam, 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 bam. And I think slowing down just your entire life, but also, like nudging every day. So it's like you might start off with 0.6 seconds of awareness. Let's see what it's like to nudge in our awareness to 0.7 seconds with no forcing that we're going to like suddenly get there. But just nudging every day until you notice a year later, actually, like I'm at 6 seconds now. Like I'm able to stay regulated.
Yeah.
And that's obviously not going to happen. Like at times we all have zero point 0.6 seconds. But I think just even knowing that there's 6 seconds for for us as humans to have available to us can be really supportive, I think.
Yeah. I mean, 6 seconds is longer than most people think. And it really can give you time, right?
Mm-hmm.
To ask yourself the question of how do I want to respond, or say, as you described to your client, just acknowledging I'm feeling really overstimulated right now. I had a client that had she actually came up with two mantras, and I can't remember what the second one is right now, but the first one was just breathe. And so as she opened up that space, she would say sort of just breathe. And my favorite story, she ended up tattooing it on her wrist so that she could look down at her wrist as a reminder. But finding that space can be, I mean, life-changing.
Yeah. And I think part of that spaciousness comes from shifting from alert to aware. Because people think like, oh, if I'm not like control, then everything's going to become out of control. And actually it's just like a gentle nudge from being alert to everything to like, how can I stay in control, but just be aware of everything that's going on.
Do you think, I mean, I hear all the things you're saying and it makes total sense, but if there's someone out there listening right now who's thinking to themselves, well, why do I have to like bring my body into this? Why can't I think there's a lot of us that, as you said, we go through our lives so disembodied and we want to rationalize everything. We want to sort of manage everything up here in our brains and kind of ignore what's going on in the rest, right?
Yeah.
So why do you find that it's so important to help bring the body into this work?
I actually find bringing the body into the work is de-shaming, because a lot of anger is your nervous system trying to keep you safe, because your nervous system is detecting threat and it is reacting in the best way a nervous system knows how to respond to threat. And why I say that's de-shaming is because these patterns within our nervous systems, they have their origins within our childhood, and it's not, we can bring it under our control, but it's not necessarily initially within our control to control our body. Our body is just doing what it's doing to try to keep us safe and to try to keep us alive. And why that can be de-shaming is it's a little bit like saying it's not entirely your fault. It's not just your sort of like, it's not entirely within your willful control. Now you can take steps to tend to your nervous system, to soothe your nervous system. But I think in the initial instance, I find it to be de-shaming, and it can be quite liberating for people to know that they don't just have to be whirling around in their head. There's things that they can do within their body which can be supportive and soothing. And I've said that word soothing quite a few times because I think often that is what parents who are highly sensitive and parents who are quick to anger need, is a lot of soothing. And I think a lot of that soothing can come from body up rather than just whirling around in your head trying to logic and rationalize. Soothing is a body up process.
Yeah.
And as I'm saying soothing, I'm like hugging myself, because even that word soothing, like it makes me, and that's really, I don't think I was able to soothe myself for my entire childhood and adult life. I wasn't able to soothe myself. And I think that is really what's changed for me, and my resilience around anger and my kind of nimbleness to be able to go into anger and not get stuck there, is my ability to soothe myself. Sometimes that's through words, soothing words and a soothing inner voice. And sometimes it's a body up soothing, like finding nurturing things that make my body feel safe.
Yeah. That is such a, I think, a beautiful way to describe. I also I feel myself sort of like putting my arms around myself as well, as you say, soothing, because it just, many of us were not given the tools or the skills as children to do that. And learning that as an adult can be really challenging, I think, for a lot of us. I'm curious. I want to go back to the story about the kazoo because it made me giggle. And that would also absolutely make me crazy. And you described it when you first started telling the story. You described that you sort of had your own kind of anger tantrum or whatever. How did, like bring us into that, back into that moment? And how did you manage that in the moment and afterwards?
So I think anger expression is all about timing, because there's something, and some people are really kind of drawn to cathartic anger release, where you kind of like screaming and jumping around and shouting. That appeals to me like a bit. And I did do a bit. Basically, I went into the kitchen and I jumped up and down. But actually, as soon as I started jumping up and down, it just really shifted my energy, because I actually was able to see what was happening. And my husband came into the kitchen. He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "It's the kazoo." and I think to kind of get over it fairly quickly, but sometimes you really need to jump up and down, and our toddlers, this is what they do. Like toddlers, like children, they jump up and down when they're angry. I think, because I've also mentioned soothing, and it might seem a bit contradictory, because I think it's all about timing. Where are you on like the anger? Are you like way up in the red, right? Soothing probably is not gonna cut it. Maybe you do need to jump around. Maybe you need to like go out for a run if that is available to you. Like maybe you need to do something to like physically discharge. But if you're kind of like on the way up to anger, I think that's when soothing's more appropriate. And I think that's why I say it's all about timing, because I think if we're always kind of doing this sort of like jumping around, we're almost like training ourselves to be angry. And I think that can get us stuck in our body thinks, this is what we do. So I would say that cathartic release can be important, but like used sparingly, and lots and lots of the soothing on the way up to anger.
Well, and what strikes me about that story, if I'm understanding it right, is you went into the kitchen and jumped up and down. You weren't yelling at your child. Your child wasn't there, right? You got the cathartic release on your own in a safe space, rather than taking that out on your child and his sweet little kazoo.
And he was so happy and excited by his sweet little kazoo. I think sometimes there can be benefit to doing some of that cathartic release, like with your kids, if you're narrating it in a way that's not scary, because you're kind of like, you can say, "Oh, I've got like so much big energy and I kind of want to shake." Like shaking can be a really powerful thing. Like, and then you can like invite your child into it. "Would you like to shake with me?" And that can be really great, because you're modeling how you ride the wave of emotions. But obviously you need to be mindful with that, because we never want to be like scaring our children. But I think that when we approach anger without shame, we can bring in a little bit of playfulness to it. Like me jumping up and down in the kitchen, like it had an element of play to it. And like I said, I started laughing when my husband came in and asked me what I was doing. But I think when we're in shame, we can't access playfulness around anger. And that might seem so weird to talk about anger and play. But I think if that does sound weird to you, consider all of the conditioning you've received around anger and like what an angry parent is, like, or how your parents reacted to you when you were angry as a child. And
Yeah.
what if we were to like strip away all of that conditioning and just see anger as a normal, natural emotion?
I think that is such a beautiful way to put it. When we look at the conditioning and sort of erasing that and seeing it as a normal, natural emotion for all of us. Emily, I think that's actually such a beautiful note to end on. And I've so enjoyed this conversation because I think what you're describing is something every single parent listening to this can relate to. I don't know a single parent. I've never met a single parent who never feels angry or gets frustrated or overwhelmed or all of those emotions that can kind of get mixed up in the same space. For those parents who are listening to this and thinking, wow, this Emily is on to something, I would like to connect with her. What is the best place for folks to find you?
So you can find me on Instagram at Finding Flow Parenting, and you can find my website, www.findingflowparenting.coach.
Okay. And we will make sure that all of those links and everything are in the show notes. You also, if I'm not mistaken, have a free webinar that folks can take on your website. Yes?
Yeah, it's called From Yelling to Thriving. And it's all about looking at yelling in a fresh light as being that protective behavior.
Which you've described so beautifully. Emily, thank you for being here. Thank you for the work that you are doing and sharing your wisdom with the listeners on the Heartful Parent Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, podcast listeners, thank you so much for joining me. I said this at the beginning. I want to say it again because I truly, truly mean it. I am grateful to you for being here, for listening and joining me on the journey of parenting. And as you know, we don't just talk about parenting, but we also talk about partnering in our professional lives. So thank you for sharing in that journey with me. Believe it or not, it helps me feel less alone as we walk this path together. I hope you got a lot out of my conversation today with Emily. She shared some great ways to find her and the work that she does. All of those links are listed in the show notes for you to find so that you can track down Emily on social media or on her website or wherever feels best to you. And I hope that you will do that because I think she's got a lot of great stuff. In the meantime, I will look forward to seeing you next week on the Heartful Parent Podcast. If you haven't already done so, please feel free to find me on Instagram or Facebook. I'm planning on getting a lot more great content out on both of those platforms. And I also hope that you would be willing to drop a 5-star review of the Heartful Parent Podcast wherever it is you listen to podcasts. It helps more parents find the podcast. And I think that the more parents who find the podcast, the more parents who feel supported, less alone, and ready to tackle the challenge of parenting with an open heart and an open mind. Cheers, everybody.